Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another interview with Democracy Hawks, in which we share stories and have discussions on issues that concern the prosperity or relapse of democracy globally. So today we are here with Professor Fish to discuss Alexei Navalny, who is a Russian opposition leader, lawyer, and anti-corruption activist who recently passed away in February. So before we start, Professor Fish, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Steve Fish. I'm a professor of political science here at Berkeley. I've been here ever since 1995, so I've been here for quite a long time. And I teach the introduction to comparative politics here. I'm one of the two professors who does that. Olivia, as you well know, because
Yes.
I had you in class. And I also teach a graduate seminar in comparative politics, as well as courses in democracy, the global threat to democracy, a course called Foundation for Political Thought and Action, which is kind of a theory course. And I've also taught a course in Russian politics.
Okay, thank you so much. And so can you please go more into depth about who Alexei Navalny is and his contributions to fighting anti-corruption in Russia?
Sure, Alexei Navalny has long been the leading figure in the Russian opposition. He is a lawyer by training, and he began his career as a stakeholder in several Russian enterprises. And he was a big advocate for greater transparency in corporate governance, and that he kind of got his start that way. Then he moved into more political activism, and anti-corruption was a big cause of his. And then he became a leader of the democratic movement itself. And he always tied anti-corruption causes to having a more democratic Russia. And as you know, he became really the leading organizer of the democratic movement in Russia, and its best known figure. His life ended tragically when he was killed just a couple of months ago in a prison that he'd been sent to for his political activities, and certainly at the behest of Vladimir Putin.
Okay. And so throughout Navalny's career in politics and activism, he has had antiseptic green dye splashed on his face in Moscow, causing him to almost go blind from chemical burns. He has been poisoned with a nerve agent and arrested more times than even Navalny himself can count. So do you think overall people are more inspired by Navalny's ability to fight back against Putin, or have they become even more scared of Putin upon seeing these things happen to Navalny?
Well, it's probably a mix of the two. Certainly when you watch how poorly he was treated, and ultimately, Putin tried to assassinate him by poisoning a few years ago. And then when that didn't work and Navalny recovered and came back to Russia, he imprisoned him and ultimately then had him assassinated in prison. That's obviously terrifying. But for someone like Navalny, who was bound to be returned to prison after he went back to Russia, after going to Germany for treatment after his poisoning, to face that kind of fate and still go back to his country anyway was very inspiring to many people. And Navalny said some interesting things that made him especially inspiring. He said, in fact, not too long before he was killed, "If they kill me, that means we're extremely strong." And what he's trying to convey is if Putin can't even live with me, being on this earth, and that means we're a real threat to him, we being those who want an open democratic Russia. And so I think he is very inspiring to many Russians. Now, as you know, Putin has so closed down the political system, created such a neo-totalitarian system in recent years, that there's very little room for organized public dissent. Anyone who steps out and even speaks against Putin in any way finds themselves in prison. That's obviously very daunting. But I do know from my many contacts in Russia that there are an awful lot of people who have been very inspired by Navalny's example.
And then speaking of Putin, Putin has referred to Alexei Navalny as a certain political force, this gentleman, and a poor excuse for a politician, but he's never explicitly uttered Navalny's name. Why do you think that is?
Olivia, that's a sign of how scared of Navalny he is. He won't even utter his name in public. Just think about what that means. Just think about what that means about how seriously Putin takes Navalny and how scared he is of him. It's as if he utters his name, he'll bring him to life and somehow be engaging with him. And he's afraid of even doing that. I think this is a sign of Putin's weakness and a sign of the extent to which he has been scared of Navalny. The fact that he tried to assassinate him and then ultimately did assassinate him after his first attempt didn't work is yet another sign of just how scared of Navalny Putin is.
Okay. And so, why doesn't Putin just own up to the fact that he killed Navalny if everybody knows that he did it?
Well, it would be a bad look for even Putin, as a head of state to say that, I had Navalny killed, what obviously would be an illegal act. And so he wouldn't say it openly. But he really, despite denials, doesn't really hide the fact that he was responsible for Navalny's poisoning and imprisonment and death. And that's kind of an evil man's flex when you really think about it. What he's saying is that I can do anything I want to anybody if they dare stand up to me. But in terms of just coming out and saying I did it, that would brand him as being even more of an outlaw than everyone already knows him to be.
Okay. And then so previously you mentioned that Navalny went back to Russia, even though he kind of had an idea of what was going to happen to him. So how do you believe that Navalny's resiliency and his humor and his ability to smile even after being sentenced to one of Russia's toughest prisons has influenced his capacity to inspire the public? And how do you think this affects Putin's attempts to try to suppress him?
It's had a huge inspirational effect, and it's part of why Putin just couldn't live with Navalny. It really is. Had Navalny buckled, had he shown that he had been crushed by his poisonings and by his prison experience, it would have made Putin look like the winner in some sense. An evil winner, to be sure, but the winner. But for Navalny to keep enduring these trials and remain optimistic, even keep smiling, even retain, as you said, his sense of humor, really, really got under Putin's skin, because what he was showing is he couldn't break him. Yeah. And of course, that makes him even more inspiring to his followers and to even people who weren't his followers necessarily. That's very inspiring work. And Navalny knew exactly what he was doing. He said in an interview shortly before he returned to Russia and then was then again in prison, that his job was not being scared. He said, "My job is to not be afraid," and he took that job very seriously. And to the very end, he stayed with that tack. And for that reason, I think was especially inspiring.
Okay, and so you mentioned Putin's involvement with Navalny's killing, but recently the Wall Street Journal published an article that claimed U.S. intelligence agencies have concluded that Vladimir Putin didn't directly order the killing of Navalny at a remote penal colony in February, and that this assessment does not absolve Putin of ultimate responsibility for his fate, only that the president did not call for his killing at that time. And then these findings were reflected a broad consensus across different intelligence agencies. So do you think there's any plausibility to this, or what do you think about that statement?
Well, Putin always, makes sure there's this element of, plausible deniability. Mm-hmm. He never comes out and says, "Oh, okay, I'm going to kill this person," and so on. But we know from a long history of assassinations in Russia that high-profile assassinations of this type, which do have an influence on, Russia's reputation in the world, that do reflect on Russia. We can also harken back to, for example, the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. Mm-hmm. Again, did Putin order it? You have to remember the way things work in regimes like this. He doesn't have to say, "Go kill this guy." And one of his staffers can say, "Oh, what do you think about Navalny?" And all Putin has to do is say nothing, or make a facial gesture alone is enough to make clear that this guy's survival is not okay with him. There is some reporting that I've seen that to the effect that he was actually going to be swapped in a prisoner exchange. And I think the fact that he was killed before that could happen is indication enough that that Putin was directly involved. I'm absolutely sure that even if Putin didn't give the order and tell them the date to do it, that this would not have happened without his consent.
And so, Navalny was killed on February 16th, and then Russia's elections happened mid-March. So do you think this could have aided in the timing of his murder?
It's possible. Putin, of course, rigs these elections to such an extent, but he's always guaranteed supermajorities. The vote is entirely rigged. disqualifies every possible candidate. He never allowed Navalny to run against him in presidential elections because he knew he might get a substantial amount of the vote. I don't know if there's a connection between the timing of Navalny's death and the elections themselves. We do know that Putin gets very scared before elections. Even though he's guaranteed overwhelming majorities, corruption is so extensive in Russia that Putin is always afraid that the massive state funds that he allocates to, getting state employees to vote and vote for him, and other things could just be stolen by his operatives in the field. And so he's always afraid things won't turn out exactly the way he wants. So we know that he always gets anxious, even before elections, that he's, of course, bound to win because he's rigged the system and disqualified all opponents.
Mhm.
It could have had something to do with it, but I'm not sure about the correlation.
Okay. And so, throughout your comparative politics course, you talk a lot about high dominance leadership skills. Do you think Navalny himself could have embodied some of those skills, and like how exactly do you think that could have
He
been?
did. Putin embodies high dominance skills, but as a very illiberal, anti-democratic politician. Navalny, and I think this is one reason why he was a threat to Putin, is also a very high dominance politician. What is a high dominance politician? It's someone who speaks their mind and sticks of their principles, regardless of what polling tells them. The high dominance politicians tell you what they want you to believe, and they try to convince you rather than reading polls and telling you what they think you want to hear.
Mm.
A high dominance politician is ever on the offense. A high dominance politician embraces us versus them framing. It says, yes, we do have political enemies here. And then there's us, and our side is morally superior. High dominance politician is willing to use even transgressive parlance and is oftentimes exuberant in pursuit of his or her goals. Navalny embodied all those traits perfectly. I think he was a very high dominance politician, a liberal pro-democratic
Yeah.
one. And I think that's part of why Putin found him so intolerable. There have been other liberal politicians who didn't embody these so-called dominance characteristics. And I think Putin didn't find them as dangerous.
Okay. And so, what about his wife, Yulia? Because after Navalny died, she vowed to continue his fight against the Kremlin and punish Putin for his death. Do you think she also could have had those high dominance qualities? And why do you think Putin, or do you think Putin will retaliate against her the same way that he retaliated against Navalny as well?
Well, she has always preferred to be out at the limelight.
Mhm.
And now we'll see what she's going to decide her role is going to be. After he was killed, she has definitely stepped up and realized that she's going to have to carry on this struggle herself. She definitely seems to be a very strong woman. We've known that for a long time. She is an extremely intelligent person as well. It remains to be seen exactly how she's going to take charge of the movement. She's living abroad now, so she's not in danger of being jailed in Russia. And so she can speak her mind. At the same time, standing up to Putin, even from abroad, is dangerous because his operatives are all over the world, suppressing and even assassinating political opponents. But so far, I'm very impressed with her performance, and I think she has the potential to really step forward and take charge of the movement.
Okay, thank you so much. And so, do you see similarities between Navalny and maybe activists fighting against authoritarianism in different parts of the world? Like, I know we talked about Maria Ressa. Do you see any similarities between her and Navalny as well?
I do. To take Maria Ressa, who's the great enemy of disinformation, who we read in our course, her book. Maria Ressa and Navalny both are, indomitable, dauntless politicians who cannot be cowed by dictators. In the case of Maria Ressa, it was Rodrigo Duterte,
Mhm.
who was the kind of, autocrat in the making in the Philippines, who she stood up to. She stood up to Facebook. She stood up to Zuckerberg and the entire kind of social media apparatus that has been allowing disinformation to spread in their platforms. And like Navalny, she really is, all grits and gut, along with having a big brain
Yeah.
to boot. And she does remind me a lot of Navalny.
Okay. And so President Joe Biden, in a statement a few days after Navalny's passing, talks about announcing more than 500 new sanctions against Russia for not only its ongoing war of conquest on Ukraine, and but the death of Navalny as well. And so as well, the EU and the UK have imposed sanctions against Russia for Navalny's killing. And do you think these sanctions will even phase Putin, considering he's a very powerful figure in Russia?
Well, we know that these sanctions don't prevent him from pushing forward with his war in Ukraine. But the sanctions do weaken his ability to prosecute the war. So I wouldn't expect new sanctions to lead him to recalculate
Mhm.
his effort to conquer Ukraine. But all these sanctions do add up to a kind of, package of problems for Putin. They have weakened the Russian economy in some ways. They have lessened his ability to prosecute the war. And for that reason, I think they tended to be very productive. And here I think we have to give President Biden a lot of credit because, Biden really organized the whole democratic world after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is a very difficult task to get, democracies primarily in Europe and in our East Asian allies as well behind this program and behind the sanctions program. And Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the EU,
Mhm.
and strong leaders in Europe, Kaja Kallas, the Prime Minister of Estonia, Sanna Marin, the former Prime Minister of Finland, many other leaders in Europe have risen to the occasion. And I think we need to give President Biden credit for really kind of pulling the team together.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if Trump were in office?
Oh God.
Nothing of the
Yeah.
sort would have happened.
Yeah. And so, how do you think Navalny's death will impact the war in Ukraine and possibly the future of politics in Russia?
I don't expect it to have an immediate effect on the war in Ukraine.
Mhm.
I think in terms of Russian politics, he will serve as a kind of icon going into the future. He will serve as a symbol of someone of kind of resistance to Putin, of fearless, dauntless resistance to authoritarianism. We have to remember too, he has certain qualities that are especially appealing to Russians. His anti-corruption campaign and the incredibly, I would say, exuberant and humorous way that he prosecuted that campaign, these hilarious videos he posted on social media that got tens of millions of views, where he exposed the corruption of Putin, of former Prime Minister and former President Medvedev as well. Very well documented, very well researched, academically extremely, respectable kind of, videos and research projects he did. But then he presented in a way that was very appealing to most Russians. He really used humor effectively. And I think he really appealed to an awful lot of people who are pretty tired of the mass corruption and authoritarianism that have characterized Russian politics under Putin.
And so, have there been any other figures in Russia like Navalny that have stood up against Putin? And if so, what happened to them too?
There have been, and these days they just find themselves serving long jail terms. So, one of the leading figures, who was Navalny-like in his moral commitment, and who I respect immensely, is Vladimir Kara-Murza.
Mhm.
He is a dauntless liberal. And his wife is now like Navalny's wife, kind of, taking charge of his legacy and movement now that he's in prison, and is also a very brave figure in the movement. He criticized the war in Ukraine very openly, and he is now serving a long, I think it's a 25-year prison sentence for doing so. He's a very intellectual type. Not a rabble rouser, not a crowd pleaser like Navalny, kind of more of an academic type of personality. But honestly, I've met him and spoken with him, and I have to say he's truly one of the most impressive human beings that I've ever met. He is his kind of his morality and his intellect and his heart are almost overwhelming when you meet him. He just has a certain presence, and he is like Navalny, utterly unafraid of, even suffering, bravely, due to his brave stance against the war in Ukraine and his stand for democracy.
And I'm curious, how did you get the opportunity to meet him in person?
Oh, there was a meeting over at the Freeman Spogli Institute over at Stanford, which is it's an institute that is partly devoted to the study of democracy. And there were leading luminaries there, like Larry Diamond and Francis Fukuyama, and they held a get together, and I was fortunate enough and honored enough to attend it. Michael McFaul, a former ambassador to Russia, who's another truly great human rights advocate, was there as well, and I had the pleasure and honor of meeting Vladimir Kara-Murza at that get together, and I hope to meet him again sometime. I hope he doesn't languish in prison for as long as he's sentenced to do so right now.
And that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for the audience for watching. Help bring to light Alexei Navalny's incredible legacy, and yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Olivia.
Thank you.
You bet.